The noon sun scorched the sage-covered plains like a blacksmith's forge, turning the air into waves of shimmering heat. Marie Curie stumbled along the dried banks of the Pecos River, her feet swollen and blistered, her torn dress clinging to her thin frame. She clutched a small cloth bundle against her chest as if it held the last remnants of her shattered life. The distant sound of cattle bells and lowing echoed across the red dust. The McCrae herd moved through the thorny brush, and Theodore Roosevelt broke away from the group of cowboys to free a calf tangled in rusted barbed wire. Theodore's old mule, stubborn as the day was long, jerked against the reins and sent his weathered hat tumbling into a mud puddle. Marie's unexpected laugh rang out across the desert, the first genuine sound of joy she'd made in months, before her knees buckled and she collapsed to the ground. Theodore helped her sit up, his voice calm and measured, maintaining enough distance to avoid frightening her. "Water here. Drink it slow now." Marie revealed her story in fragments. She'd fled from a wooden shack in the pine forests to the north. I can't go back there," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the desert wind. Theodore's eyes caught sight of the faded bruises peeking from beneath her sleeve. Without pressing for details, he draped his coat over her shoulders and built a small fire to brew weak coffee, sharing what remained of his cornbread. The other cowboys teased Theodore about picking up a new calf herder, but he deflected their curiosity with a joke, steering their attention away to preserve her dignity. On the journey back to the ranch, a dust devil whipped across their path. Theodore pulled his bandana up and signaled for Marie to press close to the horse's mane, revealing the cautious nature he'd learned from his father. The McCrae ranch came into view, weathered timber buildings, cattle pens, a stone well, the scent of pine resin, and chickens scratching in the yard. Senora Rosa, the widowed head cook, led Marie into the kitchen, carefully washing her blistered feet and applying bear grease to the wounds. Theodore introduced her briefly to his father, old Benjamin McCrae. "She needs a few days' rest," he said simply. The elder McCrae nodded, his stern eyes warming slightly in this land. Strangers in need were still fed and sheltered. That first night at the ranch, Marie startled at the sound of the barn door banging in the wind. Theodore knocked gently on the parlor door. "Just the wind. Miss, out here, the wind carries more weight than gossip." Purple hills glowed in the twilight as prairie dogs chirped their evening songs. Marie dozed fitfully to the smell of fresh-baked cornbread, the fragile sense of safety as delicate as spider silk. At dawn, Theodore left a small folding knife by the windowsill. "If having this makes you feel safer, keep it." It wasn't meant for fighting, but to return some measure of control to her life. On the kitchen table, Marie scrawled a shaky note about leaving so as not to be a burden, then crossed it out, deciding to stay one more day. Her body and heart needed shelter before she could face the road again. The first rays of sunlight painted new boundaries across the wooden floor. From a runaway seeking escape, she stood at the threshold of a second chance. Marie spent the next days repaying their kindness through work helping Rosa in the kitchen, mending torn saddles, learning to milk the cows. Her hands trembled from the pain in her ribs, but her head lifted a little higher each morning. Theodore observed the careful distance she maintained from others. He worked more than he spoke, allowing her to choose her own rhythm of approaching or withdrawing. One evening, Marie told him how her mother had taught her to count stars to forget pain. Theodore shared his dream of opening a small school for cowboys' children each winter. They saw each other more clearly through their broken pieces. Word from the town of Las Carretas seeped into the ranch. "McCrae's son is hiding a girl in the house." Benjamin frowned at the gossip but didn't send her away. He'd once owed his life to a stranger who'd saved him from a blizzard. Marie reminded herself not to lean on kindness too long, but each dawn brought coffee's aroma and Theodore's footsteps on the porch, suggesting that here, hands were meant for lifting up, not striking down. News arrived on the mail coach about someone matching her brother's description working for Cornelius Vanderbilt, a land grabber who collected property and water rights through debt and violence. The name sent ice through Marie's veins. The map on the McCrae wall marked the precious few water sources in the territory. In this land, whoever controlled water controlled life itself, and trouble invariably followed. As weeks passed, the ranch's rhythm became Marie's own. She learned to brace herself against the wind, to read the sky for rain that rarely came, to find beauty in the harsh landscape that demanded everything but gave back survival to those strong enough to endure. Theodore never asked about her past, never pushed for more than she offered. In the evenings, they'd sit on the porch watching lightning dance across the distant mesas, the smell of dry grass and far-off rain cooling their faces. The future stretched like the horizon, distant but real, waiting for those brave enough to claim it. Marie Curie had grown up in poverty at the edge of the pine forests. Her mother lost early to fever. Her father killed in a mining accident. Her brother Thomas Edison had turned to whiskey instead of food. His anger becoming as regular as sunrise, what should have been family had transformed into a prison of fear. She knew how to trap small game, cook, and mend clothes. But she'd learned far more how to walk silently, breathe quietly, survive in shadows, the skills of those who lived under constant threat. Her memories of the West weren't romanticized tales of noble cowboys. They were the stench of rot-gut whiskey and rotting wood, the sound of fists against walls and broken apologies that fell like empty bottles. Yet there was also the vast sky, wide enough to swallow tears and pretend they never existed. Theodore Roosevelt had been born on the McCrae Ranch. At 17, he'd planned to study law in Santa Fe, but drought and his mother's illness had anchored him to the land. He was the rancher's son with calloused hands and eyes that knew how to listen. Theodore often disagreed with his father. Benjamin believed in barbed wire and firearms. Theodore believed in contracts and signatures. The West of 1896 stood suspended between frontier justice and courtroom law. Senora Rosa treated Theodore like her own son, warning him that a good heart needs a strong backbone. Meanwhile, Alexander Hamilton, the silver-haired foreman, had taught Theodore to fire warning shots. Never killing shots. The harsh landscape carved itself into people's souls. Red dust settled into every crease of clothing. Yucca plants stabbed skyward like accusations, and brief rains fell like half-kept promises. Everyone who survived here carried their own kind of scars. Marie decided to repay their hospitality through labor. She helped Rosa in the kitchen, repaired torn saddles, and learned to milk cows despite her hands trembling from the lingering pain in her ribs. Each morning, she held her head a little higher. Theodore watched how she maintained careful distances from others. He let his actions speak louder than words, allowing her to choose her own pace of trust. One evening, Marie shared how her mother had taught her to count stars to forget pain. Theodore spoke of his dream to open a small school for cowboys' children each winter. They recognized each other more clearly through their broken pieces. Rumors from Las Carretas crept into the ranch. McCrae's son is keeping a girl in the house. Benjamin frowned at the gossip, worried about their reputation, but didn't send her away. He'd once owed his life to a stranger who'd pulled him from a blizzard. Marie reminded herself not to lean on kindness too long, but each dawn brought coffee's aroma and Theodore's footsteps on the porch, suggesting that here, hands were meant for lifting up rather than striking down. Word arrived on the mail coach someone matching Thomas Edison's description was working as muscle for Cornelius Vanderbilt, a man who collected land and water rights through debt and intimidation. The name sent ice through Marie's veins. The map on the McCrae wall marked the territory's scarce water sources. In this land, whoever controlled water controlled life itself, and trouble inevitably followed. Daily routines ground on mending barbed wire fences, gathering dried cattle droppings for fuel, helping calves into the world during cold nights. Marie learned to press her lips tight against the desperate cries of laboring mothers, recognizing that survival always came wrapped in pain. They hauled cowhides, salt, and flour to Las Carretas. The market bustled with noise, fiddlers playing off-key melodies, blacksmiths and seamstresses hawking their wares. Florence Nightingale, the school teacher, sold old books to fund winter classes. Alexander taught Marie to tie quick-release knots. "Life unties its own knots with patient fingers," he said. The small lesson would save lives later. Theodore guided Marie to stand outside the saloon crowds to avoid crude talk, but Marie chose to step through the doorway, purchasing thread and paper, reclaiming her right to enter public spaces. On the return journey, a dust storm struck. Theodore wrapped an extra bandana around Marie's face, joking that if you were a real cowboy, you'd curse the wind louder than that, lightening tension with humor. Rosa organized a dance in the back courtyard, paper lanterns swaying between cottonwood trees. Marie felt awkward in her borrowed dress, conscious of her scars. Theodore extended his hand, maintaining just enough distance for her to decide. In the music's embrace, Marie spoke in English without meeting anyone's eyes. She said, "I'm not beautiful like other women." And Theodore answered, simple as breathing. The rancher's son said, "That's why I want you forever." The courtyard fell silent for a heartbeat before erupting in laughter as Alexander whistled to break the tension. But the words remained, like fence posts driven into dry earth, anchoring something against the wind. They shared small tasks. Theodore read newspaper articles about the new railroad to Marie. Marie mended Theodore's shirts with such care it embarrassed him. Familiarity grew from tiny gestures. Susan Anthony, a Navajo weaver, gifted Marie a strip of sea blue wool for someone learning to breathe deeply again. The Western backdrop wasn't just guns and cattle, but threads of cultures weaving together. At night they sat on the porch, watching heat lightning streak across the mesas. The smell of dry grass and distant rain cooled their chests. The future lay like the horizon, far but real. Bad news arrived with the train. Cornelius Vanderbilt was suing the McCrae family over water rights at Stone Cup Well. His lawyers would arrive within a month. Benjamin raged, wanting to gather armed men. Theodore suggested following legal channels. Marie quietly retrieved copies of old water claim documents, promising to find witnesses. A strange rider stopped at the gate, leaving an envelope addressed to Marie Curie. No one outside a select few knew she was here. Inside a lock of her mother's hair and a note reading "Come home," Thomas had tracked her down. The past had found her despite the miles. But something had changed. She no longer stood alone. The ranch, these people, and especially Theodore had given her something she'd thought lost forever, the possibility of choosing her own path rather than running from someone else's. The days stretched long and repetitive, mending barbed wire fences, gathering dried cow chips for fuel, helping calves enter the world during cold nights. Marie learned to press her lips tight against the anguished cries of laboring mothers, understanding that survival always arrived wrapped in pain. They hauled cowhides, salt, and flour into Las Carretas. The market day erupted with noise fiddlers scratching out jarring melodies, blacksmiths hammering rhythms on anvils, seamstresses calling out their services. Florence Nightingale, the school teacher, sold worn books from a makeshift stall, raising funds for winter classes. Alexander Hamilton taught Marie to tie slip knots that released easier than cutting. "Life unties its own knots through patient fingers," he said, demonstrating the technique with rope-scarred hands. This small lesson would prove life-saving in days to come. Theodore guided Marie to stand outside the rowdy saloon crowds, hoping to shield her from crude language. But Marie stepped decisively through the doorway, purchasing thread and writing paper, reclaiming her right to occupy public spaces without apology. On the return journey, a dust storm ambushed them. Theodore secured an extra bandana around Marie's face, teasing that, if you were a proper cowboy, you'd be cursing this wind much louder, his humor lightening the tension of the moment. Rosa organized an evening dance in the back courtyard, stringing paper lanterns between the cottonwood trees. Marie felt self-conscious in her borrowed dress, acutely aware of old scars. Theodore offered his hand, maintaining just enough distance to let her choose. Lost in the music's rhythm, Marie spoke softly in English. Avoiding everyone's gaze, she said, "I'm not beautiful like other women," and Theodore responded, natural as breathing. The rancher's son said, "That's why I want you forever." The courtyard fell silent for a heartbeat, then erupted in laughter when Alexander whistled sharply to break the awkwardness. Yet the words lingered, like fence posts driven deep into parched earth, anchoring something precious against the prairie wind. They shared countless small tasks. Theodore read aloud newspaper articles about the advancing railroad while Marie listened. Marie mended Theodore's work shirts with such meticulous care it made him blush. Intimacy bloomed from these tiny, everyday gestures. Susan Anthony, a Navajo woman who sold woven blankets, presented Marie with a strip of sea blue wool. For someone learning how to breathe deeply again. She said, "The western frontier held more than guns and cattle. It was a tapestry of cultures threading together." Evenings found them on the porch, watching heat lightning dance across distant mesas. The scent of dry grass mixed with the promise of far-off rain, cooling their faces. The future stretched before them like the horizon, distant yet tangible. Troubling news arrived with the mail coach Cornelius Vanderbilt was filing suit against the McCrae family over water rights at Stone Cup Well. His lawyers would descend upon the town within the month. Benjamin's fury erupted. He wanted to gather armed riders immediately. Theodore advocated for legal remedies instead. Marie quietly retrieved copies of old water registration documents, vowing to locate witnesses who could testify. A lone rider appeared at the gate, leaving an envelope addressed to Marie Curie. Almost no one knew her location. Inside a lock of her mother's hair and a note commanding, "Come home," Thomas had tracked her down. The market days became lessons in resilience. Marie watched Theodore negotiate cattle prices with steady patience, never raising his voice even when buyers tried to cheat. She learned that strength in the West meant more than quick draws and loud threats. One scorching afternoon, they discovered a family of settlers whose wagon had broken an axle. Without hesitation, Theodore organized the ranch hands to help, while Marie tended to their dehydrated children. The frontier's harshness bred either cruelty or compassion. There was little middle ground. Alexander shared stories around the evening fire about the old days when Comanche raiders still crossed these lands. Violence was simpler then, he mused. Now we got lawyers and land grabbers sometimes. I ain't sure which is worse. Marie found unexpected allies among the town's women. Florence invited her to help with the winter school preparations, while Susan taught her traditional dyeing techniques. These connections wove a safety net she'd never known existed. The drought deepened its grip. Water levels dropped dangerously in the wells, and the cattle grew gaunt. Marie learned to read the sky for any hint of rain, understanding why water rights could drive men to desperate acts. Theodore showed her the legal documents his father had filed years ago, establishing their claim to Stone Cup Well. "Papers don't stop bullets," Benjamin grumbled. But Theodore insisted that civilization meant choosing a law over force. During a particularly violent thunderstorm, lightning struck near the cattle pen. Marie rushed out with the men to calm the panicked animals, her fear of the past momentarily forgotten in the face of immediate danger. Theodore watched her with growing admiration. She was becoming part of the ranch's heartbeat. Rosa pulled Marie aside one evening. "That boy looks at you like you hung the stars," she said bluntly. "Question is, what you gonna do about it?" Marie's hands stilled over her sewing, uncertain how to answer. The approaching legal battle cast shadows over daily life. Benjamin began teaching Theodore and Marie to shoot not for aggression, but for protection. Marie's hands trembled at first, memories of violence flooding back. But she steadied herself. This was different. This was about defending something worth keeping. Word spread that Vanderbilt had hired Thomas Edison as an enforcer. Marie's blood ran cold, but she forced herself to continue the target practice. Running was no longer an option. She had too much to lose now. One quiet evening, Theodore found Marie writing letters to potential witnesses for their water rights case. "You don't have to do this," he said softly. "It's not your fight." Marie looked up, her eyes clear and determined. "Everything I care about is here now. That makes it my fight." The transformation was subtle, but undeniable. The frightened woman who'd collapsed by the dried riverbed had evolved into someone who chose to stand her ground. The West had that effect on people. It either broke them entirely or forged them into something stronger. As autumn approached, bringing cooler nights and the promise of eventual rain, Marie realized she'd stopped looking over her shoulder. The ranch had become more than a refuge. It was home. And when home was threatened, you didn't run, you fought for it. The drought arrived like an unwelcome visitor, settling in for a long stay. Well, water dropped daily. Cattle grew skeletal, and both people and animals carried the scent of dust. The sun bore down mercilessly, like a corrupt lawman drunk on power. Cornelius Vanderbilt and his hired men set up camp near Stone Cup Well, blocking the traditional watering routes. Sheriff William Hearst turned a blind eye, even stopping by their camp to share whiskey and laughter. Rumors in Las Corretas swirled around Marie like dust devils. That girl living with the McCrae boy. One sanctimonious woman pulled her children across the street when Marie passed. Prejudice burned hotter than the desert sun. Thomas Edison appeared in the saloon, his eyes cold as winter frost, wearing an enforcer's badge. He cornered Marie on the general store's porch, speaking low, "Come back, or I'll bring trouble to this place." The smell of whiskey mixed with painful memories made her tremble. Theodore stepped out calmly, positioning himself beside her without raising his voice. "She doesn't belong to violence anymore," he said evenly. Thomas laughed bitterly, spat in the dust, and promised they'd meet again to negotiate. Vanderbilt sent Benjamin a formal invitation to discuss matters like gentlemen. It was clearly a trap, a negotiation with guns hidden beneath the table. Alexander and Rosa pleaded with them not to go. Theodore decided that if Marie wanted to attend and have her voice heard, she should. She nodded. The old fears no longer owned her silence. In the abandoned grain warehouse, Vanderbilt laid out his terms. The McCraes must surrender the well in exchange for safety. Thomas stood behind him, his hand unconsciously clenching when he noticed scars on his sister's arms. Theodore proposed legal arbitration, presenting copies of their documentation. Hearst tore them in half, tossing the pieces to the floor. Vanderbilt smiled coldly. "Law is what I pay for." The West revealed its true face. That night, the McCrae horse barn erupted in flames. The household formed a bucket brigade. Passing water hand to hand, Marie rushed into the smoke to unlock the horses. Coughing violently, memories of violence no longer paralyzed her in the face of real danger. A rifle cracked from the darkness. The bullet grazed Theodore's shoulder. Thomas held his position without firing, just watching. Another hired gun had pulled the trigger. Marie saw that her brother was also imprisoned by the darkness he'd chosen. The next morning, a notice appeared in town. Theodore was suspected of involvement in a silver shipment robbery staged by Vanderbilt. Hearst's signature transformed lies into official weight. The townspeople wavered between self-preservation and justice. Some called for immediate questioning. Lynch rope was easily woven from fear. Marie swore she wouldn't run again. She chose to stay, to fight, to find a way to prove the truth for Theodore and for herself. She visited Florence Nightingale and Reverend Charles Darwin, asking them to testify that Theodore was at the ranch the night of the supposed robbery. They agreed, though they knew the words of decent people rarely outweighed shouted accusations. Vanderbilt kidnapped Marco Rosa's grandson to force Marie to surrender the water source maps. It was a calculated blow aimed at the softest hearts. Rosa collapsed, choking back tears. "Don't trade yourself for the child." Marie shook but didn't retreat. The past had taken enough. The future wouldn't get the same chance. At dusk, Thomas secretly met his sister in the small cemetery. He spoke of whiskey-free nights filled with nightmares, his calloused hands opening and closing repeatedly. The ashes of conscience still flickered somewhere deep inside. Marie spoke plainly. "You become who you choose to stand with." Her words cut like a straight razor. Thomas didn't answer, but left behind a key to Vanderbilt's old warehouse, a crack in his wall of darkness. In the temporary jail cell, Theodore calculated his options if he ran. Hearst would have reason to shoot. If he stayed, Vanderbilt would arrange false testimony. He sent a note through Florence for his father, "Don't spill blood in my name." Marie and Alexander sketched a plan using Thomas's key. They'd slip into the warehouse to find evidence of the shipping ledger's proof that could save Theodore and destroy Vanderbilt. A thunderstorm rolled in, lightning splitting the sky above the mesas. The wind rose the perfect time for desperate gambles. Marie struggled internally. The old her wanted to flee. The new her, kindled by peaceful meals and genuine care, said go. She tucked Susan's blue wool strip into her pocket like a protective charm. Benjamin prepared to gather gunmen for a warehouse raid. Marie persuaded him, "Let me search for documents. A scalpel works better than a sledgehammer." Benjamin looked at her for the first time as an equal. A deeper fear surfaced if she saved Theodore. Would there still be a place for her at the ranch after the storm of gossip? She decided that real love didn't depend on roofs, but on how people stood together in the wind. The confrontation was building like the approaching storm. Marie had spent months learning to breathe freely, to walk without fear, to believe in tomorrow. Now she would risk it all not because she had to, but because she chose to. She thought of Theodore's patient kindness, of Rosa's fierce protectiveness, of Benjamin's gradual acceptance. This was her family now, forged not by blood but by choice, and families protected each other. As she prepared for the dangerous night ahead, Marie allowed herself one moment of fear, then pushed it aside. The woman who'd collapsed by the dried riverbed was gone. In her place stood someone who understood that courage wasn't the absence of fear, it was acting despite it. The thunder rolled closer, and Marie checked the key Thomas had left behind. Whatever happened in that warehouse, she would face it standing tall. The West had taught her many lessons, but perhaps the most important was this: sometimes you had to fight for the right to stop running. With the storm as cover and Alexander as backup, she would enter the warehouse that night. The evidence they sought could end Vanderbilt's reign of intimidation and clear Theodore's name. But first, she had to survive the night. Marie looked at her reflection in the cracked mirror. The frightened girl was still there. But now she was accompanied by a woman who'd found something worth fighting for, and that made all the difference. Theodore was disarmed in the town square as a crowd gathered. Alexander stepped forward to shield him, taking a rifle butt to his ribs for his trouble. The crowd held familiar faces and strangers who simply enjoyed chaos. Prejudice transformed strangers into monsters in the blink of an eye. Marie approached Florence Nightingale and Reverend Charles Darwin, pleading for them to testify that Theodore had been at the ranch during the alleged train robbery. They agreed, though they knew the words of decent folk rarely outweighed angry shouts. Vanderbilt seized Marco Rosa's grandson to force Marie to surrender the water source maps. It was a calculated strike at the most tender hearts. Rosa crumpled to her knees, choking back sobs. "Don't trade yourself for the boy." Marie trembled but didn't step back. The past had taken enough. The future wouldn't get the same opportunity. At twilight, Thomas Edison sought out his sister secretly in the small cemetery. He spoke of sober nights filled with nightmares, his work-worn hands clenching and unclenching repeatedly. The embers of conscience still glowed somewhere deep within. Marie spoke directly. "You become who you choose to stand with." Her words cut clean as a blade. Thomas didn't reply, but left behind a key to Vanderbilt's old warehouse, a fracture in his wall of darkness. In the makeshift cell, Theodore weighed his options. Fleeing would give Hearst an excuse to shoot. Staying meant Vanderbilt would arrange false witnesses. He sent word through Florence to his father, "Don't spill blood in my name." Marie and Alexander mapped their plan using Thomas's key. They'd infiltrate the warehouse to find shipping ledger evidence documents that could save Theodore and topple Vanderbilt. The thunderstorm arrived with vengeful fury. Lightning tore across the sky above the mesas, and the wind howled perfect cover for desperate ventures. Marie battled internally. Her old self screamed to run. Her new self, nurtured by peaceful meals and genuine care, urged, "Go forward." She pressed Susan's blue wool strip into her pocket like a talisman. Benjamin prepared to gather armed riders for a warehouse assault. Marie convinced him. "Let me search for papers. A scalpel cuts cleaner than a hammer." For the first time, Benjamin regarded her as an equal. A deeper fear emerged if she saved Theodore. Would gossip destroy her place at the ranch? She decided true love wasn't built on roofs, but on how people weathered storms together. Night fell heavy with rain. Marie and Alexander approached Vanderbilt's warehouse at the edge of Box Canyon. The air reeked of gun oil, and guards muttered harsh words. They used ropes and Alexander's easy-release knots to slip through a side entrance. Inside, Marie discovered the dockmaster's handwritten ledgers recording silver bar counts and shipping marks that matched the times Vanderbilt had met with Hearst. Evidence of the orchestrated theft. A whistle pierced the air they'd been spotted. Alexander held the door, shouting, "Run, girl!" Marie clutched the ledger and plunged into the rocky canyon where moonlight painted the walls silver. Sharp stones tore her skirt hem, but her feet moved faster than her past. Thomas appeared at the canyon mouth, blocking Vanderbilt's men momentarily. He roared, "This one's mine," then fired into the air, creating confusion among the hired guns. 1 minute of betrayal rang the bell of changing fate. In town, Florence presented a petition to delay the hanging. The Reverend rang the church bells, forcing the mob to pause in God's name, buying precious breathing room for justice. Marie rode Theodore's old mule, stubborn but loyal, racing toward the town square. The season's first rain poured down, transforming dust to mud, washing the scent of violence from the air. She delivered the ledgers to Marshal Abraham Lincoln, who'd just arrived in town after Florence's urgent telegram. The marshal read quickly, his eyes cold and professional. Turning to Hearst, "You're under arrest for obstruction of justice and conspiracy." Vanderbilt's men opened fire in chaos. Theodore, just freed from shackles, pulled Marie behind a brick wall as bullets whined overhead. He fired warning shots high, keeping the crowd at bay. Thomas found himself with Vanderbilt's gun pressed to his temple for going soft. His eyes met Marie's, a glimpse of the brother who'd once protected her before whiskey claimed the rest. He threw his elbow sideways, spoiling Vanderbilt's aim. Marshal Lincoln dropped Vanderbilt with a precise shoulder shot. The canyon and town square thundered like Judgment Day. Rain gradually ceased. People looked at each other, suddenly exhausted by manufactured courage. Justice required documentation and witnesses willing to sign their names, not just loaded guns. Marie stood trembling in Theodore's arms. He whispered against her ear, his voice strangely calm amid the chaos. "It's over." She knew over didn't apply to all wounds, but it covered the long nightmare. Thomas knelt in the rain, surrendering his weapons. He'd chosen the light too late for glory, but early enough to stop adding to the darkness. Marshal Lincoln established order methodically. Vanderbilt faced federal charges for silver theft, arson, and water rights violations. The territorial judge would arrive within the month. Several of Vanderbilt's hired guns agreed to testify in exchange for lesser sentences. The townspeople who'd been ready to hang Theodore now avoided eye contact. Some muttered apologies. Others simply melted away. Mob justice was easier than admitting they'd nearly killed an innocent man. Rosa's grandson Marco was found unharmed in an abandoned line shack, guarded by one of Vanderbilt's men who'd apparently had second thoughts about harming a child. The boy ran to his grandmother's arms as she wept with relief. Marie realized the warehouse infiltration had been more than gathering evidence. It was her declaration that she would no longer be a victim, no longer run from shadows. She'd risked everything not because she had to, but because she chose to. Theodore's shoulder wound was cleaned and bandaged by Florence, who muttered about men and their foolish heroics. But her hands were gentle, recognizing that sometimes standing up required accepting wounds. As dawn broke over the rain-washed town, Benjamin placed his weathered hand on Marie's shoulder. "You've got sand, girl. Real sand." From the taciturn rancher, it was the highest praise possible. The immediate danger had passed. But its echoes would ripple through the community for months. Some would never forgive Marie for disrupting their comfortable prejudices. Others would quietly acknowledge that courage came in unexpected packages. But in that moment, as the first rays of sun painted the desert gold, Marie stood tall despite her exhaustion. She'd found something worth fighting for, and in doing so, had found herself. Night descended as Marie and Alexander pressed against the warehouse walls at the edge of Box Canyon. The smell of gun oil hung thick in the air, and guards muttered coarse words nearby. They used ropes and the slip knots Alexander had taught knots that released easier than cutting to navigate through a side door. Inside the shadowed warehouse, Marie discovered what they'd risked everything to find: the dockmaster's handwritten ledgers. The pages detailed silver bar shipments with stamps and times that perfectly matched Vanderbilt's meetings with Sheriff Hurst. Here lay proof of the orchestrated theft. A sharp whistle split the air they'd been discovered. Alexander blocked the door with his broad shoulders, shouting, "Run, girl, run!" Marie clutched the precious ledger to her chest and plunged into the rocky canyon where moonlight poured silver paint down the walls. Sharp stones tore at her skirt hem, shredding fabric, but her feet flew faster than all the ghosts chasing her past. Thomas Edison materialized at the canyon's mouth, positioning himself between his sister and Vanderbilt's approaching men. He roared with authority, "Stand back, this one's mine," then fired his pistol skyward, the shot sowing confusion among the hired guns. That single minute of rebellion would echo through both their futures. Back in town, Florence Nightingale had submitted an emergency petition to delay any vigilante action. Reverend Darwin pulled the church bells with desperate strength, their bronze voices demanding the mob pause in the name of the Almighty, purchasing precious time for justice to catch its breath. Marie drove Theodore's cantankerous old mule forward with desperate urgency, stubborn as the day was long, but loyal when it counted. The animal carried her through the storm. The season's first real rain erupted from the heavens, transforming dust into rivers of mud, washing the stench of fear from the air. She burst into the town square just as Marshal Abraham Lincoln arrived, summoned by Florence's frantic telegrams sent days earlier. Marie thrust the water-stained ledger into his hands. The marshal's eyes moved quickly across the damning entries, his expression growing colder with each line. He turned to Hurst with deliberate calm. "William Hurst, you're under arrest for conspiracy and obstruction of justice." Chaos erupted like a powder keg. Vanderbilt's men opened fire wildly. Theodore, freed from his shackles moments before, grabbed Marie and pulled her behind the brick wall of the land office. Bullets whined overhead like angry hornets. He returned fire high into the air, warning shots to scatter the crowd rather than create more violence. Thomas found himself trapped, Vanderbilt's gun pressed hard against his temple. "You went soft on me, Edison." The land baron snarled. Thomas's eyes found Marie across the square, and in that glance, she saw a flicker of the brother who'd once stood between her and their father's drunken rages, before the bottle claimed its share. With sudden violence, Thomas drove his elbow backward, spoiling Vanderbilt's aim. Marshal Lincoln's response was swift and precise, a shot to Vanderbilt's shoulder that dropped him writhing in the mud. The canyon echoed with gunfire, while the town square erupted in its own thunder. Gradually, the rain gentled to a drizzle, then stopped. People looked at one another through the clearing gun smoke, exhausted by their moment of manufactured courage. They were learning what Marie now knew: justice required more than loaded guns. It needed papers, testimony, and people brave enough to sign their names to truth. Marie stood trembling in Theodore's embrace, her courage finally giving way to delayed shock. He held her steady, whispering against her rain-dampened hair, "It's finished. It's over." She understood that over couldn't heal every wound or erase every scar, but it could end the immediate nightmare. Sometimes that was enough. Thomas sank to his knees in the muddy street, laying his weapons in the puddles. He'd chosen the light too late for redemption's glory, but perhaps early enough to stop feeding the darkness. His shoulders shook, whether from rain or something deeper. Marie couldn't tell. Marshal Lincoln moved through the chaos with methodical precision, establishing order where pandemonium had reigned. His deputies rounded up Vanderbilt's scattered gunmen, many of whom suddenly found cooperation more appealing than loyalty to a fallen boss. The crowd that had howled for Theodore's blood just hours before now avoided meeting anyone's eyes. Some mumbled half-hearted apologies that fell flat in the mud. Others simply melted away like shadows at sunrise. It was easier to join a mob than admit they'd nearly murdered an innocent man. Word came that young Marco had been found scared but unharmed in an abandoned line shack. One of Vanderbilt's men, wrestling with whatever conscience remained, had refused to harm a child and instead kept him safe. Rosa collapsed with relief as her grandson ran into her arms. As dawn painted the eastern mountains pink and gold, the full magnitude of the night's events began settling over the town. Marie had risked everything not because circumstances forced her hand, but because she'd chosen to stand and fight. The scared girl who'd counted stars to forget pain had transformed into a woman who faced down darkness with paper and courage. Florence tended to Theodore's shoulder wound with practiced efficiency, muttering about fool men and their heroics. But her touch remained gentle, recognizing that some wounds were prices paid for principles. Benjamin McCrae stood in the square, rain still dripping from his weathered hat. He placed one calloused hand on Marie's shoulder, a gesture that spoke volumes from the taciturn rancher. "You've got true grit, girl, the kind that can't be taught or bought." His approval, hard-earned and rarely given, meant more than any eloquent speech. Alexander, nursing his bruised ribs, managed a wry smile. "Told you those knots would come in handy, though next time, let's try using them for something less exciting than sneaking through guarded warehouses." The immediate crisis had passed, but Marie understood its ripples would spread through the community for months to come. Some would never forgive her for disrupting their comfortable assumptions. Others would quietly acknowledge that courage wore unexpected faces. Yet standing there in the mud and aftermath, surrounded by people who'd risked everything alongside her, Marie felt something she'd thought lost forever belonging. Not the kind demanded by blood or circumstance, but the kind earned through choosing to protect what mattered. In the days that followed, Marshal Abraham Lincoln established proper legal proceedings with methodical precision. Court documents were filed, depositions taken, and warrants issued. Sheriff William Hurst was transported under guard to the territorial capital. Cornelius Vanderbilt faced federal charges for silver theft, arson, and illegal seizure of water rights. The town of Las Carretas struggled with collective shame. Those who had called for Theodore's blood now offered awkward apologies through nods, fresh-baked bread, and wooden crates to help repair the burned barn. Western apologies came rough-hewn but honest. Benjamin McCrae acknowledged what the night had taught him. Law might be slow, but it beats no law at all. In a gesture that stunned the community, he signed documents dedicating Stone Cup well to public use during drought seasons, maintaining management rights on a rotating basis. The handwritten words of a man who'd once trusted only guns now built bridges instead of fences. Marie reclaimed her name publicly. Florence Nightingale invited her to assist with winter school classes, where children gathered to hear her stories about counting stars. Young Marco ran freely through Rosa's kitchen again, the heartbeat of the household restored to its natural rhythm. Thomas Edison awaited trial in custody. Marie visited him, placing her hand against the iron bars. "I forgive you so I can live forward, not so I can forget," she said quietly. For the first time in years, his tears fell for something other than whiskey's burn. Theodore and Marie worked side by side rebuilding the damaged barn. Each new board they nailed into place felt like another word in their shared vocabulary of we and us. Planted deep in the desert soil, the comfortable silence of common labor healed what words couldn't reach. The rains that followed turned the prairie grass green again. Cattle grew fat on the fresh growth. During long evenings on the porch, Theodore read aloud from newspapers about new water management legislation while Marie mended clothes. She laughed softly. "You're the best law-reading cowboy I know." They learned each other's rhythms, Theodore discovered how to voice frustration instead of swallowing it until it soured. Marie learned to ask for help without feeling diminished. Maturity came through small kindnesses repeated daily until they became habit. The gossiping church ladies gradually lowered their voices. Some still watched Marie through narrowed eyes, but she didn't seek their approval. Instead, she cooked larger pots of stew and worked with steadier hands. Prejudice faded slowly when faced with consistent evidence of character. One evening, under a cold moon, Theodore approached Marie with nervous hands holding a small wooden box. Inside lay not an expensive ring, but a simple silver chain bearing a pendant etched with Stone Cup Well's image. A promise to keep the water, keep you, keep us. Marie touched the pendant gently, understanding its meaning. In this land where water meant life, Theodore offered her both not as possession but as partnership. Yes, she said simply, knowing that single word contained her whole journey from fear to freedom. The trial proceedings brought a parade of witnesses. Several of Vanderbilt's hired guns testified against him in exchange for reduced sentences. The federal judge, reviewing the evidence Marie had risked everything to obtain, delivered verdicts that would reshape the territory's approach to water rights and land ownership. Benjamin surprised everyone by testifying about the importance of legal frameworks over vigilante justice. His words carried weight precisely because everyone knew his previous stance. Change was possible, even for men set in their ways like desert stone. Word arrived that the railroad would soon reach Las Carretas, bringing new laws, new people, and new challenges. The frontier was closing, but Marie found she didn't mourn it. She'd learned that civilization wasn't about comfortable safety. It was about choosing justice, even when injustice was easier. Thomas received a lighter sentence due to his last-minute assistance, though the road to redemption stretched long before him. He began that journey in a prison work camp, learning to face each day without whiskey's false comfort. Marie wrote to him monthly, sharing news of ordinary life, the greatest gift she could offer. Alexander's ribs healed slowly, giving him ample time to share wisdom with anyone who would listen. "Funny thing about knots," he'd say, watching Marie and Theodore work together. "The strongest ones are made of 2 ropes wound together, each making the other stronger." Rosa organized another dance, this time to celebrate the harvest and survival. The whole community attended, even some who'd stood in the mob. Forgiveness in the West came not through grand gestures, but through showing up and trying again. As the seasons turned, Marie's presence at the ranch evolved from guest to family to cornerstone. She helped expand the winter school, teaching letters and numbers to children who'd known only cattle and sky. Education was another form of water in the desert necessary for growth. The memory of that violent night faded like old bruises, leaving only the lessons learned. Marie no longer startled at sudden noises or checked over her shoulder for pursuing shadows. The hypervigilance of the hunted had given way to the watchfulness of the protector. Theodore's law books multiplied on their shelves, preparation for the changes coming with railroad civilization. But he balanced study with ranch work, understanding that in the West, theoretical knowledge needed practical application to survive. One quiet afternoon, Marie found herself standing where Theodore had first found her by the banks of the now flowing Pecos. The woman reflected in the water bore little resemblance to the terrified girl who'd collapsed there. Survival had evolved into living. Running had transformed into choosing to stay. She said, "I'm not beautiful like other women," she whispered to the water, smiling at the memory. And somewhere behind her, she knew Theodore would answer as he always did, because some truths bore repeating until they became foundations strong enough to build a life upon. The West had tested them with drought and violence, prejudice and fear. But they discovered that the harshest landscape could nurture the deepest roots, that love grew strongest when threatened, and that sometimes the greatest courage was simply refusing to let go of each other's hands. As the sun set behind the mountains, painting the desert in shades of gold and purple, Marie walked back to the ranch house where lamplight beckoned through the windows. Home, The word that had once meant danger now meant safety. The journey from one definition to the other had nearly broken her. But here she stood whole, loved, and finally free. The autumn air carried a gentle coolness as the small ceremony unfolded in the McCrae Ranch courtyard. Florence Nightingale read the blessing while Rosa hung paper lanterns between the posts. Alexander Hamilton played his fiddle, coaxing melodies that danced between joy and remembrance. Benjamin McCrae silently placed his weathered hand on his son's shoulder, the briefest blessing from a man of few words. Marie wore a dress she'd altered herself. The old scars hadn't vanished, merely rested quietly beneath clean fabric. She whispered to Theodore with a voice both soft and certain, "Home is where I don't need permission to smile." The verdicts for Cornelius Vanderbilt and William Hearst were posted publicly. Thomas Edison received his sentence but earned recognition for assisting the arrest a long road to redemption, beginning with learning to stand straight in prison's harsh light. Stone Cup Well became a point of fair water distribution. Children laughed as they drew water in buckets. Florence and Marie opened winter classes in the renovated warehouse, where the alphabet rang through air that had once held only cattle sounds. Theodore erected a small sign at the ranch gate, McCrae and Company, cattle, grass, and promises kept. An awkward motto, but an honest one. During winter evenings, they sat by the fireplace. Marie read aloud thank you letters from a shepherdess mother whose child was learning to read. Theodore wrote to the territorial government requesting more books for their growing library. On the porch, when north winds whistled through board gaps, Marie would playfully repeat their old exchange. She said, "I'm not beautiful like other women," and Theodore would answer with smiling eyes. The rancher's son said, "That's why I want you forever." The western sky remained impossibly vast. Dust storms and gunshots still echoed somewhere in the distance, but within these fence lines, they'd chosen a different kind of courage, the courage of hands that held on rather than let go. Early mornings found them riding along the mesa's edge, thin mist veiling the grasslands like a bride's veil. The trail ahead stretched long and steep, dotted with wildflowers and challenges. The future promised nothing easy, only that it belonged to them. And so they continued forward, two ordinary people who knew how to mend fences, how to apologize, how to keep their word. In the Wild West, they'd planted something rarer than water trust. The railroad arrived that spring, bringing new settlers, new laws, and new possibilities. Marie helped establish a proper school building, while Theodore studied for the territorial bar examination. The frontier was closing, but their frontier, the one between two hearts, had finally opened completely. Thomas served his sentence with dignity, writing monthly letters about small victories a day without craving drink, a skill learned in the workshop, a book read by lamplight. Marie treasured each one, seeing her brother slowly rebuild himself from foundation up. The community that had once whispered behind Marie's back now sought her counsel on everything from education to water rights. Respectability hadn't come through seeking approval, but through consistent action and quiet dignity. One sunset, Theodore found Marie teaching young Marco to read beside the well. The boy's finger traced each letter carefully while Marie guided patiently. Theodore watched, seeing their future in that simple scene not just as husband and wife, but as builders of something larger than themselves. Benjamin's health began failing that winter. On his deathbed, he called Marie daughter and meant it. His last words to Theodore were practical yet profound. Keep the water flowing and the fences strong. Everything else follows. Even in death, the old rancher spoke in metaphors of survival. They buried him on the hill overlooking Stone Cup Well, where he could watch over the water rights he'd learned to share. The funeral brought together cowboys and teachers, ranchers and clerks, a testament to how one man's change of heart could ripple through a community. Spring returned with unexpected generosity. Rain fell steady and measured, filling the wells and arroyos. Grass grew tall enough to hide young calves. The desert bloomed with surprising color, as if celebrating the peace that had finally settled over the land. Marie stood in her garden, hands deep in soil, planting vegetables for the school's lunch program. The girl who'd once survived on fear and flight now cultivated food for others. Theodore watched from the porch, law book temporarily forgotten, marveling at the transformation they'd both undergone. "Remember when you couldn't even look people in the eye?" Rosa teased, watching Marie address a full schoolroom with confidence. "Remember when you thought guns solved everything?" Marie countered to Theodore, who laughed and conceded the point. The West was changing. Law books replaced six-shooters. Schools rose beside saloons, and water rights were negotiated in courtrooms instead of gunfights. But some things remained constant: the vast sky, the uncertain weather, and the need for people strong enough to face both. On their first wedding anniversary, Theodore surprised Marie with a trip to Santa Fe, where she saw her first opera and bought her first store-made dress. But what touched her most was the simple hotel registry where Theodore wrote, "Mr. and Mrs. McCrae," with such pride that the ink nearly tore through the page. Years later, when their own children asked how they'd met, Marie would begin, "I was lost in the desert, and your father found me by a dried riverbed." But the story went deeper than rescue. It was about two people who chose to stop running from the past, from themselves, from the possibility of happiness. The evening stars emerged one by one above the ranch. Marie and Theodore sat on their porch, older now, but no less devoted. The West had tested them with everything it had: drought, violence, prejudice, fear. They'd survived it all. She said, "I'm not beautiful like other women," Marie murmured, the ritual joke still bringing a smile. The rancher's son said, "That's why I want you forever," Theodore completed, pulling her close against the cooling night. And in that moment, with the coyotes calling in the distance and their children sleeping safely inside, they knew they'd won something more precious than water rights or land deeds. They'd won the right to be ordinary, to live, love, and grow old in peace. In the Wild West, that was the greatest victory of all. Thank you so much for listening to this story. I'd love to know where you're enjoying this tale. Please share in the comments below so we can connect and discuss your thoughts about Marie and Theodore's journey. If you enjoyed this story, please subscribe to Wild West Stories 1850 like this video, and hit the hype button to help more people discover these tales of love and courage in the American frontier.